Hello, I am an odd bird here. Unfortunately, I have no photos with me or visuals. I planned to take them but forgot at my summer cottage. All I'm going to tell you comes from two sources or layers. The first is family lore, what my late parents and my granny told me. And the second comes from personal contacts with Viktor that were not extensive contacts, but still quite substantial. Viktor Mutt, or Viki, as all Viktors are called all over the world, was my uncle, my late father's younger brother by 3 years. First, about his background, family background. Viktor was what we call the second generation of intelligentsia. It means his parents were educated people. His father was of very humble origin, almost a peasant's son. He became a military man. He graduated from St. Petersburg Military Academy, became a staff officer, fought in the First World War. In St. Petersburg, he met his future wife, Viktor's mother, who graduated from the Herzen Institute. That was the only institute for the whole Tsarist Russia where headmistresses for children's schools were coached. After the Soviet Bolshevik takeover, they came to Estonia. He offered his services to the newborn Estonian Republic. He fought in the war that we call the War of Independence. He was decorated, awarded, and for his services he was awarded land, like so many Estonians. It was a piece of a manor that was expropriated from the German barons. It was in southern Estonia, a place called Kiidjärve. It was a nice place. It became their family retreat, or otium, as Viktor joked, otium, their brideshead, so to say. Viktor, after the war, he joined politics for a short time, but was soon dismayed. He was a member of our parliament, but left. He didn't like this squabbling of politicians because he was rather not an easy person to get along, I suppose. He was stubborn or insisting on his own opinion, highly principled. He also fell out with his military superiors, but Estonia being a civilized country, political opponents were not executed, not beheaded. Sometimes they were sent into diplomatic exile. And Viktor's father became Estonian representative in the United States. Not full ambassador. Estonia was a poor country, couldn't afford full ambassador. His title in the end was chief consul in New York. He took his family with him, his wife and his older son, my father. Viktor was left behind because he was just born 1 year old and it was thought it's too dangerous to carry him across the water. It took more than a week. So Viktor was sent to his grandparents, to Saaremaa or Ösel, to Valjala. He was quite lucky there, I suppose. In a few years' time, though, his mother came back to fetch Viktor, and they traveled. Viktor joked about his nurse who went with them, The place where they stayed, his grandparents' place, was roughly 6 kilometers from the coast. But the nurse, a simple peasant woman called Katrin, she saw the sea for the first time when they traveled on the ocean liner to New York. What Viktor did in New York, I'm not aware of. Quite possibly he went to kindergarten and attended a few classes in prime school. At least he picked up his English there because he was fluent in English. In 1932, they returned. His parents retired to this Ootsium or Kiidjärve place. Viktor went to school to Tartu. He commuted daily. Kiidjärve was 40 kilometers from Tartu. This commuting business is important because I have to stress one point. For some reason, Viktor was not his father's favorite son. I don't know the reasons, but so it was. Of course, he was not mistreated, by no means, no, but just not much was expected of him. It's quite an irony. A bright future was not foreseen for him. And Viktor told the only time he could prepare his lessons was during this commuting on train, because as soon as he got home, it started, Vicky, do this, Vicky, do that. They were quite comfortably off, not too rich, but still. So the boys shouldn't have to do manual work. But their father was very, principled, and he insisted that boys learned manual work, manual labor. And that's why I'm quite convinced that Viktor, in his late 60s in Stockholm, he would have known how to harness a horse. Then times began to change in Estonia. First, the Russians came in with their bases. Then the coup was staged in Tallinn. Estonia joined, so to say, joined the Soviet Union, and the Russian occupation started. Very many people were arrested, including Viktor's father. He was taken away in July in 1940, and as we learned later, he was executed in 1942 in Kirov. At least that's the official version. Then the Germans came in. Viktor still attended his school in Tartu. He graduated in 1943, and then he was 20 years old, and he should have joined the German army. He got the invitation to the military camp. He went there, it was in Maardu, and he was to become an auxiliary force for Luftwaffe. But he didn't like the idea of becoming a German soldier, so he escaped from the military camp and went to Tallinn to his uncle. He couldn't stay there for long. His uncle gave him a golden watch as a fee for the boat traffickers who were taking people from Estonia to Finland to escape the refugees. So Vicky went back to Loksa, waited there for 3 weeks for a suitable boat to take him to Finland. Finally, the boat came. It was like all refugee boats, it was overcrowded. In the middle of the sea, a storm broke out. It was a terrible storm. And Vicky told he was bailing out water from the bottom of the boat, and he heard the traffickers speaking among themselves. The boat is sinking. We have to throw somebody offboard, otherwise we all will perish. And Vicky thought that he was the most insignificant person on this boat, and surely he will be thrown out. And he said that in later life, he many times saw this trip again and always woke up with his forehead rather sweaty. Luckily, no one was thrown off board because the boat capsized, turned over. It was not too deep, nobody drowned, but of course all their luggage disappeared in the water. So Vicky reached Finnish coast empty-handed, nothing. She went inland and met old man and a hermit or recluse, by chance of Estonian origin, stayed with him. He read a newspaper, an advertisement that farmhands were needed in western Finland, and he went there. He stayed in a place of two elderly sisters, spinsters, because all men were fighting and nobody was to take care of the farm. And now Vicky's knowledge of the manual work and the farm work stood him in good stead. And he became something between farmhand and a steward for those elderly sisters. Unfortunately, it didn't last long. Finland had dropped out of the war, and Russians were winning, and they put pressure on Finland that Finland must return all refugees from Estonia. And so the sisters told Vicky that they can't hide him any longer. But they gave him a letter of recommendation to their former friend in Stockholm. It was a certain Professor Jorpes. So Vicky went to Professor Jorpes's place and rang the doorbell. The first person whom he met was Professor Jorpes's assistant, a young girl, Birgitta Werner. And as it happened, she became Vicky's wife, with whom they lived together over 40 years in complete harmony. So it's a scenario for a movie like. By the way, all this we learned later. For almost 20 years, we were completely, I mean my parents and me, we were completely unaware if Viktor was alive or what had happened to him. In Stalin's time, it was dangerous to make inquiries, to have foreigners or contacts abroad. It was really dangerous. But during Khrushchev thaw at the end of the 50s, people began traveling again, at least modestly, and sportsmen and scientists, artists. And one of our family acquaintances from the old days, Professor Mora, he was to Stockholm in the beginning of the 60s and returned with a letter from Viktor, so hand-post letter, and then we learned he's alive. And then little by little our contacts resumed. But Viktor, his diploma from Tartu was not acknowledged in Sweden because it was issued by German occupation forces. It was not acknowledged. So he had to take all his exams again. But he did it in crash course. He passed 7 exams in 1 year. Of course, Birgitta helped him morally and perhaps even materially. Then Viktor entered Stockholm University. First, he took up English studies because English he knew fluently. But in a year's time, he realized that languages and humanities were not for him. He was more interested in science and natural sciences. And so he switched to medicine in Karolinska Institute. And so that he studied that's nothing new to you. They have 2 children, roughly my generation, a bit younger. One, Walter, he had many odd jobs, including taxi driver in Uppsala and a tourist guide in Egypt. He learned Chinese, Russian, among other things. Then he entered politics. He became member of Riksdag for the Green Party. He was their foreign relations spokesperson. Then switched to the Left Party. His sister, Maria, he graduated as a sculptor from Stockholm Royal Art Institute or Academy. But as it turned out, in a few years' time, she had an allergy towards those materials she had to work to make a sculpture. So she took up painting, and finally she just helped Viktor in his lab, and then edited some district newspaper, environment and things like this. But what is important, both children are 100% Swedes. Nothing, no link to Estonia. Why is that? I wondered when I was to their place at the same time in 1988. I wondered why, because it's not very usual. Vicky's own explanation was, when he came to Stockholm and he needed help, assistance, he went to those people whom he regarded as his family acquaintances from the old time. But he was turned down and he received no help from anybody. And it left such an impression on him that possibly he decided to call it quits and have nothing whatsoever to do with Estonians anymore. So he was in no way engaged in emigre activities in Sweden, what were, by the way, there was very much going on. But he didn't want it. And he imparted this attitude to his wife, Birgitta, and his children probably too. They were very open-minded, especially Birgitta, a very open-minded person. Several times he even went to developing world. She was a doctor, by the way, a children's doctor, and to help those people in developing countries, but he didn't want to know very much about Estonia. But on the other hand, when Estonia became independent or started to become independent, a set of brilliant young Estonian scholars from Tartu, they worked in Vicky's lab, and I'm sure he was glad to help those young people to advance their progress in science. And he had no grudge to Estonia, nor Estonians. And there is also one more explanation, what I have invented myself. Vicky was just a bohemian, in the best sense of the word. He didn't have very strong attachment to blood ties or things like this. He was like a medieval scholar. Wherever there were educated people, wherever there was culture, that was his or her homeland. That was most important to him. Now, what kind of person he was? I'm not impartial, of course, because he's my close relative, but in general, he was a likable person. He was not a snob, never arrogant, never on high horse. He was quite simple, easygoing, not a teetotaler, but very modest in this aspect. I remember how he told me, because I had slight drinking problems at that time, and he told me that 20 grams before turning in at night, that doesn't make you an alcoholic. But we were discussing, for instance, the benefits of healthy lifestyle. And Viktor, being benignly skeptical about all things, he explained it me this way. All this healthy food and sports and sauna, it prevents you getting a premature end. But it doesn't prolong it. Prolong what? I asked. He smiled. Prolong that what is given you by nature from with those genes. That you can prolong with all your sauna and jogging and health food only maximum 1-2 years, no more. It's quite a brave statement, I think. Then he was very fond of walking. He always walked from his place in Solna to his lab on foot every day and back. And sometimes when I was there, I accompanied him, and I was always struggling to keep up with him because he was walking so fast. And when I asked him about it, he said that as a schoolboy in Tartu, he had won a bronze medal in speed walking or race walking. That's why he walked so quickly. As for the metaphysical issues, I think he was an agnosticist. We discussed these matters too. Once we were walking, discussing about the life hereafter and beyond, and issues like this. He pointed to a rain pool. It was raining, and the bubbles were springing up, and the next moment they were bursting. And Vicky pointed at that and told me, that's exactly how our life is. We come and we go, and there is nothing more. And of course, he told it without... He was stoical, very stoically. His end came abruptly. A few months before his 75th jubilee, one day he came home, returned from his lab, felt slightly tired, and next morning just collapsed in his kitchen. As much as I know, he had not complained about his death before that. The more so, he had a doctor in the family. Birgitta was a doctor, after all. Such untimely end is, of course, tragic because he was mentally very alert, no sign of creeping old age. But on the other hand, I think it has its good side as well, because he was saved of many negative aspects of old age. In general, his life was, to my mind, was dramatic, but also rewarding. A quite nice life. And finally, I should like to retail a small side story. It belongs to what I have called in one of my books the human domino, by which I mean that life is full of all kind of various connections, or the things match in unexpected way. You can't think that it's possible. Viktor and Birgitta, in their youth, had a friend, a girl of also Estonian origin, who studied with Birgitta, studied medicine. Her name was Karin. Later he switched to chemistry. In mid-50s, Birgitta was offered a possibility to go to India as child's doctor for 2 years in the frame of some help program or assistance program for developing countries. he leaped at the chance. The only sticking point was he had son, Walter, who was just born, less than a year old. What to do with him? Birgitta couldn't take him to India. It's dangerous. So she decided to leave it with Karin, who also had a small son, a bit older than Walter, but still. It happens so that the boys became good friends, although there was the gap almost 4 years. They went hiking summertime, went in for sports, did all kinds of things like young people do. The friendship lasted almost during the university, and they were in contacts even later. Of course, later, the life led them apart. The boy's name was Svante. He went to Germany. Why is it important? It's important because of the family name of Karin and Svante. Their family name was Pääbo, the same Pääbo who studied the Neanderthal man and who recently received the Nobel Prize. So that's what human domino can be like. Thank you.
So if somebody has some questions. Yeah.
Just a short comment. Thank you for this very nice story. Would you mind publishing this story as a book?
Actually, I have done that already. I decided to publish my memoirs when I was a middle-aged man, because later in life all gets confused. So I have written about Viktor I think it was in third or second part of my memoirs, and it came out in 2007 or 6 or something. So I have, but it's not very extensive. I should make some improvements and additions.
Now more. Yeah, please. Tamas, Bartfai.
As a Hungarian who arrived to Stockholm with a boat, an East German boat, a lifeboat in which they hidden me, with the dogs walking under me. Viktor understood perfectly well how I felt. We discussed this. How does one feel as the man who might be found and thrown into the water? It was not many decades in between. But we also had another discussion with Viktor, which relates exactly to what you have been kindly retailing, namely that not only was he a bohemian in the best sense of the word, but he took very seriously that a good scientist belongs to the entire world. We have been, his lab and my lab had been taking extraordinary number of foreigners. One of that is that there are 4 or 5 of them in this room. What else can I say as a documentation? And several of them worked with both him and me, but it was not always so, like Professor Järv only worked with me. And we discussed this on occasion of that a book came from Jan Cross, who has been evaluated, re-evaluated, and so on. And I told Viktor then that I have read it because I have been bestowed upon as a gift, Treading Water, Treading Air, it was called, the translation. And Viktor said, I know, but the Swedish critics who wrote that when somebody writes in a small nation's language, then one must continue, because the language will not survive. And that's what Hungarian poets, which you always want to translate for me. I tried to translate for him, wrote translations, of course, things which he liked. And only Birgitta would interrupt this. But not because she disliked it, but because she thought it was far too sentimental and melancholic. This was postmodern Hungarian poet. And we said, but we are completely agreeing that a good scientist, that belongs not to a country, but to the world. And this is what also behind the bohemian attitude, together with this, led him to be able to take anybody and everybody. And Karolinska was not what it is now. Sweden then was a very special place. Americans wanted to study there because it was intact in Europe, where the rest wasn't. It was a very international place to be a very international scientist. And as Estonian born he was an international scientist. I very much thank you for your reminiscences. It has given to me a lot, even though I have been sitting in the same kitchen a lot.
I forgot one very important moment. When I was to that place in Solna, Vicky took from his wardrobe his tailcoat, and he showed it to me and laughed that it's his Nobel Prize tailcoat, because he puts it on only on the occasion once a year when the Nobel Prize is awarded, and he has to go up on the stage in public. Otherwise, he hated fussy clothing. Yes, he was a bohemian, not in the classical sense that he behaves extravagantly or does this and does that. Real bohemianism means freedom of mind. These are people whose kingdom is not of this world, I should say. And then the real artists and real scientists are very similar. Thank you.